When World War I broke out in August 1914, the world's attention focused on Europe. Trenches were dug in France, navies clashed at sea, and massive mobilizations were underway across the western and eastern fronts. But far away from the thunder of cannons in Europe, another front was opening, one that would stretch through jungles, across vast savannas, over mountains, and through deadly disease-ridden swamps. It was in the heart of East Africa that a guerrilla war would unfold, lasting longer than most fronts in Europe and leaving a profound impact on African societies. When the war erupted, German East Africa, encompassing modern Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi, was isolated from the rest of the German Empire. With no realistic hope of reinforcement from Germany, the local commander, Colonel Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, understood that conventional warfare would lead to quick defeat. But rather than surrender, he envisioned a bold strategy: tie down as many British and Allied troops as possible, diverting them from the European front. His weapon would be mobility, surprise, and guerrilla warfare. In early November 1914, the British launched an amphibious assault on the port city of Tanga. Commanded by inexperienced officers and poorly planned, the British force, mainly composed of Indian troops, vastly outnumbered Lettow-Vorbeck's defenders. Yet the Germans, along with their loyal Askari troops, African soldiers trained in the German colonial army, stood firm. What followed was one of the most humiliating British defeats of the war. Despite being outgunned and outnumbered, the Germans held their ground. British forces panicked under fire, leading to chaos and a disorderly retreat. They left behind hundreds of rifles, thousands of rounds of ammunition, and supplies, all of which were scooped up by the Germans. With confidence and momentum on his side, Lettow-Vorbeck began launching raids into British East Africa, modern-day Kenya, sabotaging railways, attacking forts, and ambushing patrols. He understood the psychological and logistical value of hit-and-run warfare. His Askari troops were disciplined, and his knowledge of the terrain gave him a powerful edge. This phase laid the foundation for the guerrilla campaign that would make him legendary. By 1916, the British realized that Lettow-Vorbeck posed a serious threat. The initial underestimation of his forces had cost them dearly. In response, they called upon General Jan Smuts, a Boer War veteran and South African statesman, to lead a large-scale Allied offensive. Smuts was no stranger to guerrilla warfare, having fought against the British as a Boer general. Now, ironically, he was tasked with leading British Imperial forces against a German guerrilla commander in Africa. Smuts assembled a diverse army: British regulars, South African soldiers, Indian battalions, and African troops from Nigeria, Ghana, Nyasaland, Malawi, Uganda, and beyond. At its peak, the Allied force numbered over 300,000, including more than 600,000 African porters, also known as carriers. These porters were the true engine of the campaign. Without modern vehicles, the movement of food, ammunition, tents, and medical supplies depended entirely on human labor. These men, many conscripted or coerced into service, endured harsh conditions: long marches barefoot, little food, tropical diseases, and brutal weather. Smuts launched a series of coordinated attacks from the north and west. Forces pushed into German East Africa from Kenya, while Belgian troops from the Congo advanced from the west. Slowly but steadily, the Allies took key towns: Tabora, an important administrative center, and Dar es Salaam, the capital. But Lettow-Vorbeck did not offer a decisive battle. He avoided being pinned down, retreating strategically into the dense interior. There, his army, though small, survived by foraging, raiding enemy supply lines, and using captured weapons. His tactics frustrated the Allies, who found themselves unable to deliver a knockout blow. By 1917, the campaign had reached a new phase. The British, now stretched thin and war-weary, reduced their commitment in East Africa. Jan Smuts was recalled to London, leaving behind a fragmented and less aggressive Allied command. Meanwhile, Lettow-Vorbeck's force, though vastly outnumbered, continued to evade capture. His army, which had shrunk to just a few thousand men, moved with remarkable agility. He was now a phantom general, constantly moving, attacking outposts, and disappearing into the bush. Running low on supplies and facing increasing pressure, Lettow-Vorbeck made a daring decision: to invade Portuguese Mozambique, which had recently joined the war on the Allied side. Portuguese defenses were weak, and Lettow-Vorbeck's troops overran several garrisons, seizing rifles, ammunition, and desperately needed food. In Mozambique, the Germans replenished their ranks with captured Portuguese soldiers and continued their march. For over a year, Lettow-Vorbeck and his men lived off the land, constantly pursued, but never caught. By now, their clothes were in tatters, and their boots worn to shreds, but their discipline remained intact. In 1918, as the war in Europe drew to a close, Lettow-Vorbeck moved north into northern Rhodesia, now Zambia. Despite malaria, dysentery, and constant exhaustion, his ghost army remained undefeated. Everywhere he went, local African communities suffered, forced to provide food, shelter, or labor, often at gunpoint. The human cost of his campaign, especially for civilians, was devastating. On November 11, 1918, the guns of Europe fell silent. The armistice had been signed. But in the remote corners of Africa, Lettow-Vorbeck had no wireless communication, no telegraphs, and no knowledge that the war had ended. It wasn't until November 23, when a British official reached his camp, that he learned of Germany's surrender. 2 days later, on November 25, 1918, near the town of Oberkorn, now Mbala, Zambia, he formally laid down his arms. He did so with dignity and without ever being defeated in battle. His remaining force, a ragtag group of about 1,500 men, including German officers, African Askari, and captured Portuguese soldiers, marched in formation, weapons in hand, to surrender. British officers saluted them in respect. The East African campaign was devastating for the African population. More than 100,000 African porters and civilians died, mainly from disease, starvation, and overwork. The campaign left local economies ruined, crops destroyed, and villages depopulated. Despite their central role, African soldiers and porters received little recognition or compensation after the war. Their contributions remained in the shadows of history. Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck returned to Germany as a hero. He was admired even by his former enemies for his discipline, strategy, and chivalry. He later refused to serve under Hitler, lived modestly, and died in 1964. In one symbolic gesture, West Germany paid pensions to surviving African Askari soldiers in the 1950s, decades after the war. The East African Campaign was not just a sideshow, it was a brutal, prolonged, and consequential chapter of World War I. It tested the limits of endurance, highlighted the cruelty of colonial warfare, and revealed the extraordinary resilience of African soldiers and civilians. Though often forgotten, this campaign deserves to be remembered, not just for its battles, but for the silent suffering of those who carried the weight of empire on their shoulders.